Our session today will focus on the concept of multi-purpose trade policy and how competing narratives about globalization are reshaping international trade cooperation. My name is Nathalie Bernasconi, and I'm the Executive Director of IISD Europe, and I am extremely pleased to be here with all of you, and of course with Nicolas. We are in the midst of a dramatic turmoil in international economic relations. After turbulent Trump years and a continued right-wing populist rise in many Western democracies, in the midst of a global pandemic, a rising food crisis, and now a war, you, Nicolas, argue that a new approach to trade policy is taking shape, an approach that you call a multi-purpose trade policy. You will explain to us today this concept, but the thrust is that trade policy is no longer just about trade liberalization, but instead tries to use trade policies to directly achieve other substantive policy objectives, including lifting up workers, addressing inequality, building resilient supply chains, safeguarding national security, and advancing climate objectives. So today, we will discuss the implications of the shift towards this multi-purpose trade policy for international trade cooperation. This discussion builds, of course, on the book that you co-authored with Anthea Roberts, entitled Faces of Globalization: Who Wins, Who Loses, and Why It Matters. And here it is. The book lays out the competing narratives about economic globalization that are informing this shift to multi-purpose trade policy. And I'm, of course, as you know, a fan of this book, and I think it took place or took shape during the Trump years, yes, but well before COVID and well before, of course, the war. So it's a really new context right now that I look forward to discussing in relation to this book and what you think about this multi-purpose trade policy. So, Nicolas, if you don't already know, you are Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, and also you lead several initiatives on international law and trade at Queen's. Previously, you worked at the Appellate Body Secretariat of the World Trade Organization. We won't go down and talk about that right now. But let us now begin with a presentation on multi-purpose trade policy and how competing narratives about globalization are reshaping international trade cooperation. After the presentation, we will open the floor to questions after some discussion amongst the two of us. And as I said, we are recording the session and intend to put it online, but we're not live streaming. So if you do something strange, we can cut it out at the audience. So just kidding. Let's listen to Nicolas.
Well, thank you so much, Nathalie. I just want to begin by thanking you for having us for the second time. We had the chance to present at the first Trade Hub, and also I want to say the book came out in October last year in Europe, and this is my first ever in-person event on the book. We've done dozens online, but so this is very special. A quick roadmap to the presentation. I'm going to introduce the different narratives that we distill in the book, although they have evolved a bit since we published the book. I will then talk about the emergence of multi-purpose trade policy, and finally sketch the implications for multilateral trade cooperation. So the origins of the book is the pushback against globalization. Nathalie mentioned Trump, but it was not just Trump. It was also Brexit in the UK, and in 2015, of course, we had also had huge protests in Germany and other European countries against TTIP and CETA, which were mostly directed against the investment provisions in those agreements. And so what Anthea and I set out to do in the book is to map this backlash, and we identified different narratives. We were trying to understand, well, how does Trump differ from the left-wing organizations that were leading the backlash in Europe? How do the Brexiteers differ from unions in the United States? And that's what we set out to do. So what did we come up with? We start out with the establishment narrative, which was really the narrative that informed the approach to globalization in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And if there's one graph that encapsulates this narrative, it's this hockey stick of global prosperity, which shows that for millennia we were just hovering around the minimum of existence, and then once specialization, the Industrial Revolution and the first wave of globalization took hold, living standards shot up in this hockey stick fashion. The establishment narrative was also convinced that trade and greater international economic interdependence would lead to peace among nations. That was one of the driving motivations for Cordell Hull when the GATT was being negotiated. So the idea was that liberalization of trade would lead to prosperity and peace. Of course, then we had Trump coming onto the scene. He had a very different story to tell. This is an image from a documentary called Death by China by Peter Navarro, who was Donald Trump's trade czar. And the way he describes globalization is essentially it's a process of theft. The jobs are being stolen by China, and with the help of multinationals, they're being shipped overseas. And the US workers, they're essentially left without their property, right? Their jobs that used to be theirs. And that conception resonated, because for many who suddenly lost their livelihoods, this loss was not just an economic loss to which they could easily adjust. It meant that they lost the status in their community, they lost their sense of self-worth. And particularly in the United States, it also had a devastating health impact. So we saw a rise, which you can see in this graph, of so-called deaths of despair, death by suicide, alcohol, and drugs rising, especially among white Americans, and particularly in those communities that have been affected by the exit of manufacturing jobs. On the left, we also have a critique of globalization, but it takes a very different tack. It essentially doesn't deny that globalization does lead to more prosperity and productivity growth, but it says, well, all that growth has, at least since the late 1970s, early 1980s, been appropriated by the top 1%, or at best the top 10%. So we see the top line is the productivity growth, and then you see wages for non-supervisory work essentially flatlining since the 1970s. And so narratives from the left, in the book we actually have two, one about corporate power, one about left-wing populism. They also point out that if you look internationally, it's mostly the corporations, multinational corporations, that are benefiting. Because what happens when a factory moves from Canada or the United States to Mexico? It's not that those cushy jobs with benefits that we had in the US and Canada are now suddenly super high-paying, cushy jobs in Mexico. No, they become really shitty jobs when you go to Mexico. So in the process, it's the corporation that appropriates all the gains. So whereas the right-wing Trumpists say the workers in developing countries, they're stealing our jobs, the left says, no, it's actually workers in both countries are actually suffering here, because the workers in Canada and Mexico, Canada, US, they are losing their jobs. The workers in Mexico, they're not actually being paid for what they fairly for what they're producing, and it's the corporations and the owners who are reaping all the benefits in the process. Then around the same time, in 2018, we also have this emergence of what particularly my co-author Anthea Roberts has described as this geoeconomic narrative, which draws attention to how globalization leads to a shift in power relations between different countries. And of course, the rise of China, which you see in this graph, was the most important event. The geoeconomic narrative also takes a completely different view of the relationship between trade and international economic dependence and peace. Whereas the establishment narrative saw peace as something that follows trade liberalization and international economic interdependence, the geoeconomic narrative essentially says that you can't really responsibly be international economic interdependent if you don't trust the parties that you are trading with, right? Because in a way, peace and trust is a precondition for responsibly engaging in trade. And of course, while we were writing this book, we were mostly thinking, and this narrative was mostly manifesting itself in the relationship between the United States and China, or the West and China. But since the book came out, that narrative has, of course, been supercharged by the Russian attack against Ukraine, and Germany is suddenly waking up and noticing that it was incredibly dependent on Russia and didn't want to be that anymore. So Germany was actually one of the last holdouts for the establishment narrative, thinking that through interdependence you could kind of bring Russia to the right side, and the war has definitely proven them wrong. Of course, we know what happened during the pandemic. A new term, a new concept came to the fore, and that was the concept of resilience. Public officials suddenly found themselves scrambling to procure personal protective equipment. The picture on your right is of the ships piling up before the port of Shanghai, waiting to be able to unload. And so suddenly we became aware that maybe if we have all these efficient supply chains, it's actually not such a great idea, because if something happens, then we're suddenly left scrambling for products, or we have these, if we're just dependent on a single supplier, then we're not resilient. As soon as a shock happens, we're out in the cold. And finally, a hugely important narrative that we heard a lot about today points out that impressive hockey stick of global prosperity that we saw on the slide of the establishment narrative also corresponds to an equally impressive hockey stick of global carbon emissions that has accompanied the particular type of globalization that we have been promoting, which essentially has exported Western patterns of consumption and production all over the world, and has led to unsustainable and extremely dangerous conditions. This is just showing above average temperature from a few weeks ago in India, Pakistan. Wherever you look, people are suffering, but of course especially in developing countries, small island nations, from climate change. So these are the narratives that have been coming to the fore in the past couple of years. They've always been there, but they've been more towards the fringes. We saw them in Seattle in 1999, but in the last couple of years, they really have come to the center of political debates, and also in some countries to the center of power. So how have policymakers, and particularly trade policy makers, reacted? I have to start with the caveat that this backlash against globalization that I've been describing has been predominantly a Western phenomenon, and so I have to apologize that my discussion now is also going to be primarily about how Western countries, and particularly the United States and the European Union, have reacted, but I'd be happy to speak more about the developing country perspective a bit later. The interesting element or the developments here that many of the non-Western countries have now become champions of globalization. So for example, this metaphor which is key to the establishment narrative, the idea that we can grow the pie, we have to grow the pie so everybody can get a better piece, has now been adopted by China. So this was China on the first day of the ministerial 2 days ago, saying that we have to make the pie bigger. And that's not only establishment thinking because it focuses on growth, economic growth, it also is this idea that there's this division of labor between trade policy and everything else. Trade policy is in business of growing the pie, right? So we're making sure that there's more pie to go around, and then other policy areas, in particular domestic policy, takes care of making sure that that pie is put to good use, right? So the idea is, well, if we grow the pie, then people are going to be more able to invest in environmentally friendly technologies. They're going to be able to invest in social policy and can make sure that everybody gets their fair share. But that's not really the business of trade policy. The idea is the business of trade policy is to liberalize, create prosperity, and domestic policy takes care of the rest. So that's the old view. And what we see now, both particularly in the United States and the European Union, is a realization that maybe that's not the way to go, or at least they don't want to go that way anymore. So you see here Catherine Tai in her very memorable address in Munich. I'm sorry, I think it was actually earlier this year, where she said maybe global conditions have changed, and that model of globalization that we've been promoting, that's maybe not that good anymore, right? So we have to reassess the way we do trade, the way we do globalization. And so even though if we pursue other objectives through trade policy, such as lifting up workers, the US famously has the worker-centric trade policy, or promoting resilience or sustainability, that may cost more, but maybe that's the kind of globalization that we want. And she describes it here as globalization 2.0, right? And the primary feature of that is no longer about efficiency, right? So to simply say, well, this is not an efficient course of action, it's going to cost more, it's going to mean you're going to be uncompetitive, that argument does not fly anymore for those who promote this view of trade policy. Sabine Weyand for the European Commission has maybe been most explicit in laying out the way trade policy is changing. Right? So the big question that trade now has to answer, according to her, is like, how can it address the big tests, climate change, labor rights, security, resilience in the context of the pandemic. And the key change here is that now trade is being asked to achieve these objectives much more directly. So we can no longer say trade just leads to greater prosperity and we can then use that money to achieve all these other objectives. There's a real attempt to bring these objectives directly into trade policy and have them shape trade policy. Well, one cynical response could simply be, well, maybe that's just a fancy term for protectionism. Like maybe saying trade is trying to do all these other things, they're just really trying to do good old-fashioned protectionism. And he could be excused for thinking that, particularly in the case of the United States, because it does happen to coincide with quite a bit of protectionism. But I just want to give you one example here. Well, there is definitely a move towards self-reliance, particularly in sectors such as semiconductors. We see massive investment in semiconductor manufacturing, which makes sense from a number of perspectives, right? So if you're concerned about resilience, say you're a German car maker who never again wants to stop their factory because they don't have any semiconductors, it makes sense to have some more production in Europe. If you are a US national security hawk who's worried about China invading Taiwan and taking over all advanced semiconductor manufacturing, it makes sense to have some production in the United States. Or if you're a Trump who just wants to bring all manufacturing back to the United States, it also makes sense to bring it back. So it just so happens that several of these narratives overlap on greater national self-reliance. But you can see, depending on where you put the emphasis, if you're mostly concerned about resilience and geo-economic competition, it might also make sense to diversify among allies, to friendshore, right? It might say it makes sense to build new supply chains, but not just in your country, but with your allies. So I completely understand the cynics. I completely understand that a lot of this looks just like protectionism that is dressed up in nice words, but there's arguably more going on as well. So what does all this mean for multilateral trade corporations? So in a way it's good. Trade is getting a lot of attention. Like trade is getting a lot of tasks. It's getting asked to do a lot of stuff. Many of us have become aware of supply chains, that there is this thing of supply chains in the first place. It's not just something that Amazon creates magically. It actually has to be shipped from somewhere. And so that could also increase potential areas for cooperation. Right? On the other hand, we also see, going hand in hand with this move, a rediscovery of a wide range of tools, and particularly unilateral measures or minilateral formats. The steel arrangement between the US and EU was mentioned earlier, but of course particularly the United States has rediscovered its unilateral trade instruments, Section 301, Section 232, and unilateral national security designations and so forth. So a lot of this is not being done in a cooperative manner. We also see arguably greater geographic fragmentation. So there may well be increased integration. I just showed you the slide which showed diversification among allies as one policy option. But that would suggest that we might see further international interdependence among strategic allies. But at the same time, you might see decoupling among strategic rivals, as we're seeing now in dramatic fashion between the European Union or the West and Russia. But a key question for the WTO, of course, and trade negotiations more broadly, is whether the traditional model of trade negotiations still works. And so this is going to get a bit complicated. I hope to be able to explain what I'm trying to do here. So, in a way, the way trade negotiations used to work in the multilateral system is that you could think of trade negotiations as a trade policy market, right? Where one country pays for a trade policy change by another country by making concessions in the form of changing its own trade policies. So, and of course, the quintessential model of that is a tariff negotiation where you lower your tariff in return for another country lowering their tariff. And so if you think about the scope of that trade policy market, it's bounded on three sides. On one side, you have non-negotiable measures, right? So measures that you don't want to negotiate about. So take, for example, Canada's supply management system. Canada's no matter which price another country might pay, Canada's not going to give up its system of supply management for dairy farmers. Or the EU is not going to negotiate on certain SPS issues. They're never going to let hormone-treated beef into the EU. So those measures that are non-negotiable are not part of the market, right? You can't buy them. They're not for sale. Another thing that's excluded from the trade policy market is illegal measures. Right? So if you're maintaining a measure that is illegal, you can't use it as bargaining coin because the other country can simply say, look, you're not even allowed to maintain those measures, right? And so you just have to remove them as a matter of law. And finally, we could think of the policy market being bounded by measures that countries try to achieve together, right? Where they collectively pursue a common goal, where they say, like, we all want this, let's just do it, instead of trying to pay each other off. So if that's the traditional shape of the trade policy market, what has happened in the last couple of years, and in particular with this movement towards multi-purpose trade policy, where we see a lot of more issues being moved into the non-negotiable column, right? That's particularly in national security matters. Anything that's designated as national security is presumptively non-negotiable. But also some resilience issues, right? We say we have to make sure that we have control of our outputs in this particular area, where you're not really willing to negotiate it anymore. At the same time, we have seen, of course, from the United States, the adoption of a lot of illegal measures. The Section 301 tariffs toward China, arguably the national security tariffs, which again, countries are not willing to negotiate around those. In fact, what they've done, they've retaliated with illegal measures on their own. So essentially what emerged was kind of this black market for trade policies that was functioning on the side. So if you look at China, US trade negotiations, they're not happening in the WTO. They're not about WTO tariff bindings. They're happening in this kind of weird US-China universe where everything they do is illegal anyway, right? So the only thing that gives cause for hope is that countries manage to move these issues that they care so much about, these new objectives that they're pursuing, into the kind of collective pursuit of a common goal area. And we see that arguably with fishery subsidies. And I'm really struck by the comment from Isabel in the previous session, where she said when they asked Santiago Wills, the chair of the fishery subsidies negotiations, about the trade-offs between the different areas, and he said, according to her, it's really difficult to trade off sustainability, right? Because everybody has an interest in sustainable fishery sources, so of course there are going to be small trade-offs among elements, but it's really weird to ask someone, give me sustainable fisheries, like I'll give that up, I'll pay you for that. So it's that logic that used to work in trade negotiations no longer works on these new issues, and so we are really reliant on countries recognizing their common interest in achieving these objectives, which is arguably more fragile than when you could rely on their self-interest that was playing out in the trade policy market. So overall, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the upside, I think, is that it brings trade-offs among different policy goals into the open. One of my chief complaints about the establishment narrative was always that it made it seem that there was really no question that one policy was the best. Like you liberalize, everything becomes more efficient, there's really no room for debate. Instead of recognizing, yes, some people are going to lose their jobs and they're not necessarily going to be able to adjust. So there's going to be some real suffering as a result of this liberalization. And we just have to be prepared to say, okay, there's going to be suffering, but we're willing to tolerate it, right? Whereas arguably when we recognize there are all these different goals, those conflicts are coming into the open. The best example was the solar tariffs that the Trump administration has been grappling with, where recently the Biden administration said, okay, for 2 years there are going to be no new tariffs on solar as a result of these anti-circumvention proceedings, simply saying, okay, yes, there's a climate goal that conflicts with our interest in having US manufacturing jobs. And in this context, where we have this shortage of solar panels, the climate goal takes precedence. And so we're going to open it for 2 years. We're going to promise no new tariffs, right? So there, you had the conflict in the open, and the Biden administration made one call, right? So that's one example. Another one that's being discussed again. Sorry, another U.S. example, but the U.S. is just just so flagrant about all of this, right? So you have these massive tariffs that are maintained against Chinese products, and people like Janet Yellen are saying, well, that's actually bad for inflation, and it drives up the price of products. It's bad for the poorest parts of the population because they are paying the most, so it's bad for inequality. These goals are out there in the open, they're being debated, and that trade-off has to be made, right? And so the challenge is really to develop frameworks for thinking through these trade-offs and being open about them, communicating them, and I think that's something policymakers are still grappling with. What is the role of the World Trade Organization in all this? I think it's going to be highly variable. There's going to be areas where there's still room for negotiations, and I think that's the areas where you have these recognition of common objectives. Fishery subsidies is the best example, and my hope is that if it's successful, we'll move on to fossil fuel subsidies, which would be such a great contribution. In other areas, I think the role of the WTO is going to be supervision, and ideally I would see that role in the context of national security measures, where ideally would have some kind of committee, as Simon Lester has proposed, which would supervise national security measures and somehow organize like a managed deliberalization in that, where one country is maintaining such measures. Hopefully there's going to be monitoring and policy learning. We had, again, one of the speakers mentioned CBAM, Border Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to have a huge effect on other countries' trade. And so if the WTO could be used to discuss best practices, develop best practices, that would be fantastic. But we also have to be realistic that there are some areas that are so toxic, such as labor rights, that probably the WTO is not going to have a role. There's not going to be a committee on trade and labor in the WTO, as far as I can see. So in conclusion, I think we're heading towards a more balanced and fragmented form of globalization, more balanced in the sense of seeking to strike a balance between different values, not just only efficiency, but also resilience, sustainability, less inequality, like more good jobs, but also more fragmented, that you have like multi-speed in some way, in some areas, in some trade relationships it's going to expand, in others it's going to retract, and even you might even see full decoupling. And so what WTO members really have to do is to try to use the WTO flexibly and in a wide different range of roles depending on which policy area we're dealing with. It's unrealistic to aim for multilateral negotiations on every topic. In some areas we just have to accept that WTO is going to play a different role, which may be equally valuable. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for the invitation. I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And I think there will be a lot of questions, but let me start with a few questions first. So, I mean, I remember talking about these relationships between trade and other policy objectives for a very long time, at least a decade, 2 decades, right? Or since the beginning of the WTO. So what do you think is different now in this respect?
Well, that's of course another challenge for this concept, that we could simply say, well, this has been around forever. What's really different? I think the key difference is that the effects of trade policy on other policy area was in the past often conceived of as externalities, positive or negative externalities. So, for example, when Cordell Hull thought about peace as a result of trade liberalization, he thought of it as something that would emerge as a side effect. That would, as long as we had non-discriminatory trade, open trade, it would just emerge as a positive side effect. And some economists make the same argument about labor and environmental rights. Those who said we don't really have to have provisions on labor rights or environmental obligations in trade agreements often said, well, it will come naturally as people grow more prosperous, they demand a clean environment, they are more insistent on having their labor rights protected. So as a positive externality of trade liberalization and the ensuing prosperity, we will accomplish all these other objectives. Of course, many others saw negative externalities. They saw overexploitation of resources, they saw a lowering of the environmental standards, and so they saw a conflict between trade obligations and these other objectives. And so they conceptualized the relationship as a conflictual one, and focused on creating more policy space, expanding exceptions, such as, for example, under Article 20. And that's how I see mostly the trade and debate around the turn of the millennium, when you had cases such as US shrimp or US tuna, Mexico. There was really a concern about how much policy space does trade law, the trade obligation, give you. But until relatively recently, I think the role of trade policy hasn't been seen as actively promoting these other objectives. Of course, the fishery subsidies negotiations are an example of exactly that approach, which is we are trying to use trade tools in order to achieve what's ultimately primarily an environmental objective. Yeah, there are going to be some efficiency gains, but they're really secondary to that environmental objective. And of course, you see it in the area of labor rights in the context of preferential trade agreements, where particularly in USMCA with the labor rapid response mechanism, it's really primarily about improving labor rights. Of course, there's a hope that it will then have an effect on competitiveness between different countries. But I do think there's a new quality to it. It's no longer about something that will just happen, no longer something that is just something that is a conflict that we have to deal with. It's something that is actively your main objective, and you think about how can we use trade tools to achieve that objective. And you saw it also in the discussion just now. Really what's happening here is thinking about trade tools as a way of achieving environmental objective, reducing plastic pollution, addressing climate change. And that's a debate that we didn't have in the same form 20 years ago, I would say.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you're saying, I mean, the situation is actually the same, but what's different is that the lens in which you think about the objective of the WTO, for example, or the objective, which was already integrated at the beginning, but it was kind of ignored, right? There was the reference always to sustainable development, but the objective in the end, you're saying, was liberalization, and the rest will come automatically. Interesting. Okay. So yes, I think that we'll see what happens with the fisheries discussions, and that will surely influence some of the future of the WTO and its objectives. Also, just one more question. On balance, do you think that the inclusion of new policy objectives in the trade policy space, do you think it will make international cooperation or trade cooperation easier or more difficult?
It really depends on the objective. So there's no single answer in my view to that. I do think the greatest scope for cooperation is actually in the environmental space, because we saw the amazing presentation from Ecuador, for example. It's such a vital objective for many developing countries, and so because obviously they realize they're in danger, they are losing some of their most valuable assets due to pollution, and so in some areas I do see a lot of scope for cooperation, and particularly environmental. In other areas, countries they're either inherently divisive, such as national security, and so the best way we can hope for in terms of cooperation is agreeing on some kind of framework for at least discussion, or maybe organized, managed deliberalization when countries insist that their national security interests are at stake. And yet there are other ones where it's even harder to imagine any kind of discussion in the multilateral forum, such as labor rights. And so there's no single answer. It's not an either positive or negative message. Of course, the hope is that we will concentrate on those areas like where there's scope for corporations, and do as little damage in the other areas.
Thank you very much for that as well. I think that's a really interesting piece as well, that there may be, areas like some of the environmental goals where you can rally a lot of countries behind, hopefully with different backgrounds, whereas other areas will be very difficult. I would like to go back to, or not go back to, but maybe address the developing country aspect a little bit. But I think I do want to, well, maybe we can ask that question and then we'll open, because we started a little late, so we have a bit more time to open the floor. But just before we open the floor, I think it's very important to think about the role of developing countries, because we see that these multi-purpose trade policy approaches are really pushed more in general by developed countries, or is this a mistaken kind of understanding? Is it also, you know, supported and pushed by developing countries, or in a different way? So maybe you have a view on that, and then I'll open the floor and stop asking questions.
Well, my ability to speak to that as someone who is from a developed country and works in a developed country is, of course, limited. But the way I see it is, as far as I can tell, developing countries are probably somewhat in two minds about it. You have developing countries like India, who clearly have, for a long time, pursued other objectives than efficiency in their trade policy. India just came forward at the beginning of the ministerial saying our main issue is public stockholding for food security purposes. So food security is for India one of these chief concerns. So I think, and many developing countries probably have similar objectives, which are not necessarily just efficiency or the old model of trade liberalization. At the same time, there's this long history of skepticism on the part of developing countries of what developed countries are up to when they're invoking all these glorious other goals, and the suspicion often justify that it's mainly pretext for shutting down markets. I mean, that's why we never got the labor rights or environmental discussions even in the old mold off the ground in the WTO, because there was this fear that it's just going to be a pretext for protectionism. And if you put yourself in China's shoes, it's easy to suspect that some of the implications of national security, for example, are often just a protectionist tool. And so what the burden that developed countries have here is really to show that they're genuine. And that means both taking seriously what used to be described as non-trade objectives of developing countries, which we now, I would say, describe as multi-purpose or new purpose of trade policy objectives, such as food security, while at the same time being very scrupulous to make sure that they are, when they claim to be pursuing trade policies in the service of other objectives, such as, for example, climate change, in the case of carbon border adjustment mechanism, that they really eliminate all aspects of those policies which do not serve that objective, so that it cannot be mistaken for really a protectionist tool. And I think in order to win developing countries' trust that the pursuit of these objectives is genuine, developed countries have to be extremely careful to make sure that they don't abuse the implication of these new objectives.
Well, thank you. So this reference to genuine really resounds, I think. And I think we heard in previous discussions how important it is to, for example, on border carbon adjustments, to have this diplomatic discussion, to hear developing countries on their views on what the EU, for example, is doing and so forth. So I think that's a really good point. So I think I'll open the floor now. I think you raised so many interesting issues that I'm hoping that people will ask more. Yes?
This one? Okay, yeah. So first of all, thank you for the amazing presentation. I found it very interesting, particularly your focus on narratives. And my question is really about narratives. So when we speak about narratives, it's clear to me that we're not just speaking about something that governments at different points of time come up with without a reason. There are clearly other forces behind each government that shape the way they see these narratives, and that for me is represented by what we like to call stakeholders, civil society. In the field of labor, you might have social partners. And I was wondering whether in your book, or even now, you would like to explore how the role of stakeholders has evolved through these narratives, and how you see perhaps playing a role in this multi-purpose approach that tries to balance these different compelling narratives, because clearly these narratives must come from somewhere.
That's a fantastic question. I should say that the book is not a sociological study, so we do not trace necessarily where these narratives come from. We identify certain key protagonists, of course, of the narrative. But one important objective for us in writing the book was not to try to dismiss the narrative and say, okay, this is cynical, or somebody is paying to distribute this narrative, but really to take them at face value, because the ones that we look at, and we don't look at, for example, conspiracy theories, the ones that we look at are narratives that at least that are genuinely held by a large portion of the populations in the West, at least. And so our approach was to say, okay, understand these narratives, put ourselves in the shoes of those who are proponents of the narratives, so we can see how the world looks from their perspective. On the role of stakeholders, I do think that there is an opportunity here with these kind of the world being in flux, kind of the dominant narrative having been dethroned and all these narratives competing for supremacy. There's a role here for stakeholders, or an opportunity for stakeholders to reframe their objectives, not purely in opposition to the prevailing or like objective. So they're not seen as simply blocking or being anti-trade, but essentially saying, well, trade should be doing something different or should be done differently. And that could be an opportunity for more constructive engagement in the discussion. So I remember I used to work at the WTO at the Everybody Secretariat, and it was always so upsetting when you saw NGOs just opposing the Everybody, just saying it's bad what the Everybody does, even or the WTO does, even when actually some of the rulings were making things better for the environment. And so that I do think that stakeholders have a real opportunity, especially at this particular moment in time, to see how can they align themselves with these narratives and amplify them.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? I'll take one more question, I think, because we are at time, but we started late, so I'd love to hear from you.
Hi, thanks again for the excellent presentation. Maybe somewhat related to the previous question, I was thinking about the establishment narrative and the fact that most of us who've worked on trade policy are very familiar with that, and we're familiar with the kind of elegant economic theories that underpin that, focusing on the benefits of specialization and the logic behind trade, which is, as you mentioned, very efficiency-based. And I'm just wondering, in your research, were there economic theories that underlie some of the other narratives that you found compelling, or you would encourage the next generation of trade policy and economists to read, or is economic theory less important there, and is there no kind of grand economic theory that really underpins those narratives? Thanks.
Thank you for that excellent question. So, interestingly, even the establishment narrative is not something that's fully supported by economists. That's where most economists go, but economists like Daniel Roderick or Paul Krugman have long been pointed out that in trade models they are losers. So the idea that everybody wins through some magic adjustment processes or redistribution processes is not even supported fully by economic theory. The other interesting development that we've seen is that some of the other narratives were only being taken seriously by economists or by the establishment once there were economists actually backing that up. And I think, of course, of the China shock literature by David Autor, which really lent some force to the establishment, to the protectionist or right-wing populist view that actually the people who were affected by Chinese imports, they were not adjusting. And even many years later, wages had not recovered from the shock. And so once the economists kind of showed that there was truth to something that sociologists and political observers had known for many years, then it gained a particular heft. So we really have to, I think, question maybe the status that economics gets. But economics is an incredibly diverse discipline. So for each of these narratives, there are concepts, economic concepts that we can use to make sense of it, and also kind of approve aspects of the narratives. We are not economists, neither Anthea or I are economists, so we're not in a position to do that. But clearly we draw on economists in describing each of the narratives. And so the reason we focus on narratives is because it's not purely about the facts, it's not purely about empirics, it's also about values, right? Each narrative brings forward a different set of values and tells a different set of stories, focuses on a different aspect of the phenomenon. And so facts don't give you the whole picture, and you can't settle the debate among the narratives with facts. You have to be able to speak to the values and to the stories that others tell.
Well, thank you. I think that's an excellent way to actually close the discussions. So I would like to thank everybody for coming in person to this event. And I'd like to thank Nicolas, of course. And I would encourage you to read the book. And I am going to ask Nicolas to dedicate it. And next time I see Anthea, I'll ask her as well. So thank you very much, and hope to see you tomorrow. We have another screening and some snacks as usual. Thank you.